I'm actually not doing much in the way of speaking today. When we saw that this film was coming up, this is the Watershed Programmers and I, we thought it'd be a great opportunity to complement the showing of the film with some introductions and a panel discussion, which will be next Sunday. Because I think this film has a particular relevance and resonance for Bristol, a city, of course, with a transatlantic slave past, an inequality that has survived that in many ways, and also, of course, a city with a Bristol bus boycott as part of its proud heritage too. And in fact, that bus boycott was inspired very much by the actions and the deeds of Martin Luther King, but not just Martin Luther King, and as the film will show, many other people who were involved in the campaign to end segregation in the South. I've spoken to a young person today who wasn't much aware of what that context of civil rights struggle was about. But in fact, looking at this audience today of various faces, sort of Benetton audience, it wouldn't have been possible 60 years ago in the South, in the States. And also in England, in fact, we had the colour bar, malicious but not legally codified. So this film is about that transformative moment in which social action, the agency of foot soldiers and leaders and so on came together to create real social change and struggle. And in many ways also, it's not just, as I've said in a piece I've written for the Watershed, a revisionist piece of history, nor just a kind of chest-beating moment of triumph, but it's incredibly relevant to today, to the challenges that we face in terms of inequality and also in terms of the choices we have as to what are the means and the strategies for social change. With that in mind, I've asked a mayoral candidate and a Labour candidate, Marvin Rees, who's a close friend who I've known for many years, to come forward and to say a few words about Martin Luther King and how he has inspired him in his personal journey into leadership and civic life. Thank you.
Of course, I'm the former mayoral candidate. I didn't win. Thank you very much, Edson. I came to see the film last night as a preview, and I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, because I certainly went to bed last night really concerned about what I could possibly say. And I think when you see the film, you'll understand. It's not just about it's not about the film craft in itself for me, and I'm no connoisseur of the arts in that sense that I could offer any kind of coherent analysis of the way the film is put together. But it was what it did was it opened up a door where there was an opportunity to really enter into the fullness of what was going on at that particular moment in time. And my wife is an American. She's a white American. And her background, she would not necessarily like me saying this, her family background is quite Republican, quite conservative in many ways. And we had a fascinating conversation last night just about what this film meant for her and her sense of her sense of self, and also the stories and the narratives she grew up with around what it meant to be an American. And certainly for me, it's not, this film is not, and this story, I should start talking about the story, not just the film. It's not something that happened over there in history on the other side of the Atlantic. It is relevant today. And so many of the themes that are brought up, and I'll share a few thoughts now, so many of the themes that are brought to the table I think are absolutely real going on right now. And the fact that it was a crossroads time in American history shouldn't be stuck on that moment in time today, because in many ways in today's world we're at crossroad moments too. What's going to happen with climate change? What's going to happen with global inequality? What's going to happen in stability? What's going to happen with people's allegiance or sense of buy-in to our national story and our national identity? We are at crossroads. Unfortunately, the kind of extent of consumerism and so forth kind of medicates against our ability to engage with that. But I would just say a few things really quickly. I lived in Washington a few years ago. I shared an office with a man called Emery Searcy, who was a Black Baptist minister from Atlanta. When I moved into the office, he was in his 60s, and he knew the King family. And I spent a lot of time working with Emery on a bit of kind of social activism projects we were running in the US at the time. And he told me lots of things about what King was and what he represented. And first, I'd just say that to think about the context to this whole story, the context, the big political backdrop is the Cold War. And the competition in Africa, Asia, and Latin America between the Soviets and the United States saying, join our side. So the civil rights becomes, in some sense, a legislated apartheid becomes a political liability. So there's a huge backdrop around how this story is being portrayed, both within the United States and around the world. Secondly, I'd say within this as well, think about King on a journey. I get frustrated because I got frustrated a few years ago when everyone was celebrating I Have a Dream. And I always thought it's really easy to relate to King's dream because it's on a mountaintop. There was radical stuff in that speech, but it's on the mountaintop, we hold hands, we get together, we sing Kumbaya, that's easy. But actually King was talking about incredibly unpalatable issues. I won't read it all out, but I've got a fantastic book of King's speeches, and he talks about capitalism, he talks about foreign policy, he talks about Vietnam, he talks about inequality, he talks about triple evils at the heart of American society: militarism, consumerism, and racism. And he talks about America being on the wrong side of a world revolution. It's an incredible journey of increasing unpalatability that King was on at tremendous personal cost, not just in the eyes of white America. And what Emery told me was that when King spoke out against Vietnam in 1967, Lyndon Johnson phoned him up and called him every name under the sun, said, I gave you the Civil Rights Act, I gave you the Voting Rights Act, how dare you step beyond your boundaries and speak about foreign policy. But also against the black leadership in the civil rights movement. He said, you're jeopardizing the movement because you're becoming too radical, you're becoming unpalatable. So think of King's journey within that as you look at this piece. I'd say too, it's worth thinking about the dynamics within the movement itself. First of all, the competition within the movement, the competition for who's going to have the voice. I mean, I experienced this very personally myself when I was a candidate. And sometimes people in the movements I'm associated with saw it as a kind of a sellout movement to the status quo. You're just buying into the political system, Marvin. You're not radical enough anymore, and this, that, and the other. I'm really not comparing myself to King. I'm not. But you got to kind of get that sense where he is walking a tightrope, where he's dealing with the political establishment, and there are people standing there saying to him, "You are not being radical enough. You need to be more forceful. This non-violent stuff is soft soap." And you hear King refer to that this in the piece. And a beautiful moment, actually, where in this story, where there's a beautiful interaction with Malcolm X that's in a number of books, where X essentially says, if they don't deal with you, they've got to deal with me. And it really speaks to the role of political activism, I think, that the role of political activism his role in making radical politics much more possible and much more likely and sometimes inevitable. It doesn't mean political activism is constantly attacking politics, but it's about recognizing its role in creating a context in which more radical politics is more possible. In line with that, one of the men I worked with in the US, Jim Wallace, talked about King, the Selma moment itself and our responsibility as active citizens. And he says, King goes to Johnson and says, I need this. Johnson says, I can't get it. We've run out of our political capital. I cannot get this bill passed. And King says, it doesn't use those words, but he says to himself, I'm going to go away and I'm going to create a climate where we can get more progressive legislation passed. The legislation wasn't everything, but it was a major part of making advancements in the US. And there's also the competition for glory as well, I think, that comes through powerfully. Even within movements for good things, you get people behaving despicably and trying to pursue good ends for their own glory. That's not just in electoral politics, that's in activism too. And I think we see some of those dynamics, and certainly something I kind of have to reflect on. We have to check ourselves. The guy I live with in DC said it's much more dangerous to be invited to breakfast at the White House than it is to be opposed by the White House. Talking about the seductiveness of respectability and the seductiveness of being drawn into the table and being given status. This is something everyone who's campaigning has to be on guard of. And I think finally, what I think is worth reflecting on as the film goes on is the humanness of this whole of King. Again, talking to my wife, we went home last night and reflected on our own experience. That I think we can look at people in public life and see them as isolated individuals and not take account of them having families and children. And certainly I heard of the the anti-apartheid movement, the number of families that lost fathers and husbands and partners during that movement, not just that they passed away, but so much of their life was committed to the movement that it had an incredible toll on their family life. And I think this film does a wonderful job of giving us an insight into a human being that was fallen and a human being that was vulnerable. And because he was fallen and vulnerable, it means that the activism that is on display is not something that is otherworldly, distant to us, that you have to be a saint to be a part of, but it makes it something very possible for us all to engage with. So I will shut up, enjoy the film. Thank you.